On a cold, rainy night, a widow running a small roadside diner notices a trucker counting coins to pay for his coffee. She quietly refills his thermos and sends him off with food, never expecting to see him again. But a week later, the sound of dozens of diesel engines shakes the parking lot, and what happens next will change both their lives. The rain had been falling for hours, the kind of slow, steady drizzle that seeped into your bones. Outside Kate's mile-marker cafe, the highway was a ribbon of wet asphalt, glowing under the sodium street lamps. It was past midnight, Kate's usual quiet hour, when the rush had long faded and the occasional late-night driver trickled in. Kate Hunt moved behind the counter, wiping it down more out of habit than necessity. At 38, she'd been running the diner alone for 5 years, ever since the accident that had taken Michael. Some nights, the loneliness pressed in on her like the rain against the windows. But she kept going, serving coffee, flipping eggs, and pretending she didn't notice how many regulars had drifted away to the shiny new cafe up the road. The bell over the door jingled, and a gust of damp air followed the man who stepped inside. He wasn't a stranger exactly. Kate had seen him a handful of times before, usually late at night and always alone. Mid to late 40s, maybe. Lean, weathered, with lines carved deep into his face. His damp jacket was zipped to the chin, and a battered thermos clunked against the counter as he sat down. He didn't open the menu. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small stack of coins. Quarters, dimes, a few nickels, no bills. He turned them over in his hand, his eyes fixed on the swirling silver like they held an answer he couldn't find. Finally, he set them down and cleared his throat. "Just coffee," he said. His voice was low, almost apologetic. Kate nodded, pouring the steaming liquid into a chipped white mug. As she slid it toward him, her gaze fell to the thermos. Empty, the lid off. She glanced back at the man. He hadn't touched the mug yet, just sat there, shoulders hunched, staring into the steam. "You want me to fill that up for you?" she asked, gesturing to the thermos. He hesitated, then gave a single, tight nod. She took it without asking for payment, topping it off with fresh coffee. While it filled, she moved to the grill and assembled a simple ham and cheese sandwich, wrapping it neatly in wax paper. She placed it beside the thermos when she returned. His brow furrowed. "I didn't order. It's on the house," Kate said quickly, before he could finish. "Something for the road." He blinked, clearly unsure how to respond. "Thank you," he murmured, almost too quietly to hear. He slid the coins toward her, and she pretended not to notice they didn't quite cover the coffee. When he stood to leave, the weight of the thermos in his hand seemed to surprise him, as if he hadn't expected warmth to be part of his night. The door jingled again, and then he was gone, back into the drizzle, the red glow of his truck's taillights fading into the dark. Kate watched through the window until the lights disappeared. She didn't know his name, but something about him lingered. She'd seen plenty of truckers in her time, laughing, grumbling, tired, but this one carried silence like armor, and she recognized that look. She'd seen it in Michael, in the weeks after he came back from his final military deployment. That faraway stare, like part of him was still somewhere else. The rest of the night passed quietly. A couple of regulars dropped in, making small talk about the rain, the weather reports, the new cafe that had opened down the road. Kate listened, smiled, but her thoughts kept drifting to the man with the empty thermos. 3 nights later, Freddie stepped in. A tall, broad man in his 60s with a limp and a baseball cap worn to threads. He'd been Michael's best friend, and though he rarely said it, he checked in on Kate as often as he could. He slid onto a stool, ordering his usual. "You holding up?" he asked casually. Kate shrugged. "Best I can. Oven's on its last legs, and business isn't what it used to be." Freddie gave her a long look. "You ever think about selling?" The question landed like a stone in her stomach. "No," she said sharply. "This place is all I've got." He didn't press her, just sipped his coffee. But she caught the worry in his eyes. Freddie knew how tight money had been since Michael's death. Repairs kept piling up, customers trickled away, and every month the gap between bills and income grew wider. Meanwhile, miles away, Joshua Gibson. Though Kate didn't know his name yet, pulled his rig into a rest area. He'd been driving since dawn, the road stretching endlessly under a low gray sky. He parked, climbed into the sleeper cab, and leaned back against the wall. The coffee from that night was long gone, but he still remembered the quiet kindness in the woman's voice. He didn't get much of that these days. He'd been with the same trucking company for years, once a dependable part of the team. But since his last bad run, when an accident upstate had rattled him in ways he couldn't shake, he'd pulled back. No more convoy trips, no more swapping stories at fuel stops. Just solo runs where the only voices he heard were on the CB, and even those he ignored most of the time. The truth was, money was tight. Freight had been slow, and between repairs on his aging truck and the cost of fuel, he'd been scraping by. Paying for meals in coins wasn't just habit, it was necessity. That night, as he sat in his cab, the sandwich still fresh in his memory, Joshua found himself thinking about things he'd buried deep. The camaraderie of the road, the men and women who'd once felt like family, and the way it felt when someone noticed you not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Back in her diner, Kate locked up, the rain finally easing outside. She stood for a moment in the doorway, breathing in the damp night air. It was the same routine she'd done for years, but somehow it felt different tonight. She couldn't explain why. She didn't know that miles away, Joshua was turning over a decision in his mind. A decision that would send ripples down the road and back into her life sooner than either of them could imagine. The storm that had washed over the diner a few nights earlier had moved east, but the chill lingered. Morning light slid through the blinds of Kate's cafe, catching on the chrome of the counter stools. Kate stood at the griddle, cooking eggs for 2 loggers on their way upstate. Her mind wasn't on the order, it was on the man with the empty thermos. She'd replayed that moment more than she cared to admit. The coins in his hand, the way he hesitated before speaking, the quiet thank you that sounded like it hadn't been used in years. By the time the loggers left, the diner was empty again. Kate rinsed plates in the sink, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Business had been slow for months, and she'd been doing the mental math each night. How long she could keep the doors open before the numbers finally didn't work. The new cafe 10 miles up the highway had glossy signs, digital menus, and deep corporate pockets. She had charm, grit, and an aging kitchen that coughed more than it cooked. Miles away, Joshua Gibson eased his rig into a fuel station on the edge of a small Wyoming town. His company's yard was only 2 hours down the road, but he needed a break. The CB radio hissed softly in the background, mostly static. He'd been keeping it turned low for months, avoiding the chatter that used to be his lifeline. Inside the truck stop, he grabbed a cup of coffee and paid in quarters. The cashier, a young man with tired eyes, didn't bother hiding his impatience as he counted the coins. Joshua felt the old flicker of shame but brushed it aside. On his way out, a voice caught him off guard. "Hey, Josh Gibson, right?" He turned to see Andrea Temple, a fellow driver from his company. She was in her early 40s, quick-witted, with the kind of laugh you could hear over an idling engine. She hadn't seen him in months. "Andrea," he said, managing a small smile. She studied him for a beat. "You've been running ghost miles. Folks have been asking where you've been." Joshua shrugged. "Just keeping busy." But Andrea didn't buy it. "Heard a story the other day. Some diner out near mile marker 212. Lady filled your thermos and packed you food for the road. That you?" Joshua looked away. "Yeah." Andrea's grin softened into something else, something like pride. "You know, that kind of thing matters. People remember it. Word gets around." She told him she'd mentioned the story over the radio a few nights back, and other drivers had chimed in. "Some of us were talking. Maybe it's time we show up there. Make it worth her while." Joshua didn't respond right away. The idea of walking into that diner again, especially with other people, made his chest tighten. But as he got back into his truck, he realized that this thought didn't feel entirely heavy. Back at the diner, Kate's day took an unexpected turn when a health inspector came by unannounced. The visit was routine, but the notes he left stung, especially the warning about her aging ventilation hood and the cracked linoleum near the prep station. Repairs would cost more than she had. Freddie stopped in that afternoon, catching her between customers. "I told you, Katie, you can't run this place on willpower alone. You need help." Kate sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. "Help costs money, Freddie. And right now, money's not on the menu." Freddie leaned in. "Sometimes help doesn't come from where you expect. You've done more for folks passing through here than you realize. One day it might come back around." Kate didn't argue, but she'd heard enough hard luck talk to know that most debts of kindness go unpaid. That evening, Joshua parked his truck in the company lot for the first time in weeks. The dispatch office was warm, smelling faintly of coffee and diesel. Inside, a half-dozen drivers sat around a worn table, swapping stories. He was halfway to the back door when someone spotted him. "Well, if it ain't Gibson," a voice called. It was Tom Sutter, a veteran of the road with a belly like a barrel and hands big enough to crush a gearshift. Joshua gave a nod and sat down, letting the talk wash over him. Before long, the conversation shifted to Andrea's story about Kate's cafe. One by one, the drivers threw in their own takes, how it reminded them of the old days, when truck stops weren't chains and the people serving you knew your name. Then Tom leaned forward. "We're heading that way Friday morning. Thought we'd make a run of it, fill that place to the rafters, spend some real money. Let her know she's appreciated." "You in?" Joshua hesitated. He'd been keeping his distance for so long that the thought of rejoining the fold felt dangerous. But then he thought of Kate's face when she handed him that sandwich, of the way her voice cut through the noise of the road. He found himself nodding. "Yeah, I'm in." The next 2 days passed in a blur of runs and refueling. Joshua caught himself listening to the CB again, the old rhythm of the road seeping back in. Late Thursday night, as he parked for the final leg toward Kate's cafe, he felt something he hadn't in months: anticipation. And back at mile marker 212, Kate was closing up for the night, wiping down the counter. She didn't know that a plan was already rolling her way, carried on the backs of diesel rigs and old friendships. The rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy, the kind of stillness that sometimes comes right before the sound of engines fills the horizon. The first light of morning crept over the highway, turning the wet asphalt into a ribbon of gold and silver. Kate Hunt stood alone in her kitchen, hair pulled back, apron tied, moving through the motions of opening Kate's mile marker cafe. She cracked eggs onto the griddle, the sizzle echoing in the empty room. The early quiet was usually her favorite time of day, but lately it felt heavy, too much space for her thoughts to wander. She had barely finished setting the first pot of coffee to brew when a low vibration began to hum through the floor. At first, she thought it was a passing truck, maybe two. But the sound didn't fade. It grew deeper, layered, like rolling thunder that refused to break. Kate stepped toward the front window, a towel still in her hands. Over the rise in the road, gleaming chrome and painted cabs began to appear, one after another, their hazard lights flashing in the dim morning. They weren't slowing to pass. They were pulling in. Her breath caught. The parking lot filled with the hiss of air brakes and the thrum of idling engines. One by one, trucks slid into place, lining up so tightly they nearly blocked the diner's view of the highway. Reds, blues, silvers, a few with murals painted on their sides, each one shining against the pale light. By the time she counted past 10, she realized there were more coming. The first driver through the door was Tom Sutter, barrel-chested and grinning like he'd just struck gold. "Mornin', ma'am," he boomed. "Hope you've got enough coffee." Behind him came Andrea Temple, waving cheerfully as she held the door for a younger driver hauling in a duffel of his own mugs. More faces followed, laughing, talking over each other, shaking off the cold. The diner, which had been silent seconds ago, was suddenly alive. Kate blinked, caught between shock and habit. Just take a seat anywhere," she managed, moving for the coffee pots. Within minutes, every stool and booth was full. The air filled with the smell of frying bacon and the low rumble of voices swapping road stories. A few drivers she recognized vaguely, men and women who'd stopped in once or twice over the years, but most were strangers. Still, they greeted her like an old friend. Joshua Gibson was the last to arrive. He stepped through the doorway quietly, scanning the room until his gaze landed on Kate behind the counter. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he crossed the space and set his thermos down in front of her. Not empty this time, but ready. Kate smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. "Coffee, please," he said, his voice steady in a way it hadn't been before. He took a seat near the window, and almost immediately, a driver dropped into the chair across from him, clapping him on the shoulder. Others joined in, teasing, asking where he'd been hiding, ribbing him for running solo like a ghost. Joshua didn't retreat. He listened, he answered, and more than once, Kate caught him smiling, really smiling. As the orders piled in, Kate worked with the speed and precision of someone who'd been doing this for decades. Andrea hopped behind the counter to help pour coffee, while Tom bussed tables without asking. The atmosphere was unlike anything Kate had felt in years. Laughter bounced off the walls, the clink of forks and knives mingling with the constant hiss of the griddle. Halfway through the rush, a younger driver named Lewis leaned over the counter. "You know why we're here, right?" Kate glanced up from plating pancakes. "Because you're hungry?" Lewis chuckled. "Well, that too. But mostly because of him." He nodded toward Joshua, who was deep in conversation with Andrea. "He told us what you did that night. The coffee, the sandwich, how you didn't treat him like he was some charity case. That stuff matters out here. More than you think." Kate froze for a moment, the words sinking in. She hadn't expected thanks. She hadn't even thought it was anything special. Just something you do when you see someone in need. By late morning, the diner looked like a scene from another time. One where the road still bound people together like a family. Outside, the trucks stood in a perfect line, hazard lights winking in the sun. A sight so striking that passing motorists slowed to stare. Freddie arrived mid-morning, pushing the door open with a look of disbelief. "What in God's name?" he muttered, scanning the packed room. Kate couldn't help grinning as she poured him a cup of coffee. "Full house today," she said, unable to hide the pride in her voice. He leaned on the counter, shaking his head. "I'll be damned. Looks like maybe you've still got some fight left in this place after all." When the last plates were cleared, and the din began to quiet, Joshua stood. The room followed suit, the conversations fading into expectant silence. He cleared his throat, eyes sweeping over the drivers. "Didn't expect any of this," he began. "I've been out of touch for a while, but you all showing up like this, it means more than I can say. And to you, Kate, thanks for reminding me what it's like to be seen." It wasn't a long speech, but it didn't have to be. The nods around the room said everything. Kate felt something shift inside her then. Not just relief, but a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she'd lost. This diner wasn't just hers. It was part of the road. And the road, it seemed, hadn't forgotten her. When the last truck left, the smell of the last batch of cookies and coffee still lingered. Kate stood in the doorway, watching the convoy merge back onto the highway. She didn't know what would come of this, if it was just a one-time show of solidarity or something more, but she felt like maybe the tide was finally turning. What she couldn't know yet was that the real surprise was still coming, carried in the plans those drivers and their company had been making long before they'd pulled into her lot. The next morning, Kate moved through the diner with a strange, restless energy. The booths were empty again, but the echoes of yesterday's laughter still clung to the walls. Every time she glanced at the parking lot, she half expected to see the line of trucks return, engines rumbling in unison. The rush of that morning had been more than just good business. It had been life breathed back into a place she feared was on its last legs. She'd made enough in one day to cover a week's worth of bills. But it wasn't just about the money. Something had shifted. She was scrubbing down the counter when the bell over the door jingled. Andrea stepped inside, carrying a clipboard and wearing the same easy grin from the day before. Behind her came Tom Sutter, and a man Kate didn't recognize, mid-50s, dressed in a company jacket with a silver badge on the chest. "Kate," Andrea began, "this is Mark Reynolds, our regional manager." Mark offered his hand. "Mind if we sit for a bit? We've got something to run by you." Kate blinked but nodded, leading them to a booth by the window. Mark got straight to the point. We've been talking with the drivers and yesterday made one thing clear. This place is worth investing in. Not just for the coffee or the food, but for what it represents. Out here, good stops are about trust, not just convenience. You've built that, Kate, and we want to make sure it lasts. Kate tried to follow as he outlined their idea. The company would make Kate's Mile Marker Cafe an official stop for their fleet. That meant steady traffic, guaranteed business, and a commitment to promote it among partner carriers. But there was more. They planned to fund a full renovation. New kitchen equipment, upgraded seating, fresh signage, even resurfacing the parking lot so rigs could pull in more easily. Kate's jaw tightened. That sounds huge. But why me? Andrea leaned forward. Because you didn't just serve coffee to Joshua that night. You reminded all of us what it feels like to be treated like people, not just transactions. The road can be a lonely place, and you make it less so. Mark glanced toward the counter, where Joshua himself now stood, thermos in hand. He must have slipped in while they were talking. We've also got one more thing to announce, Mark said, gesturing toward Joshua. He's agreed to take on a new role with the company, driver mentorship and training. Keeps him on the road, but puts him in a position to look out for the younger drivers. Pass on what he knows. Joshua cleared his throat. Figured it was time to stop hiding out. Yesterday reminded me that I'm not done out here. And neither's this place. Kate felt an unexpected lump in her throat. She'd seen him at his most guarded. Coins clinking in his palm, eyes distant. Now he stood a little taller, a quiet resolve in his voice. The weeks that followed were a blur of change. Crews came in to measure, paint, and replace. New booths went in, polished chrome catching the light from the front windows. The old ventilation hood, long a thorn in Kate's side, was replaced with a gleaming stainless steel unit that hummed quietly instead of rattling. One afternoon, Andrea arrived with a framed photograph and a small brass plaque. The photo was of Michael Hunt, taken years earlier at the diner's grand opening, his arms slung around Kate's shoulders. The plaque read, "In honor of those who keep the road alive, past and present." It was mounted in a corner of the diner, alongside a growing wall of photos from drivers across the country. Kate ran her hand over the plaque, her throat tight. "He would have liked this," she said softly. Joshua nodded beside her. "It's not just for him. It's for all of us who find a piece of home here." When the renovations were done, the company organized a reopening day. By mid-morning, the lot was full again. Not 20 trucks this time, but closer to 50. Families came too, children climbing into cabs to honk the horns while drivers swapped stories. The smell of fresh paint mixed with the aroma of frying bacon and brewed coffee. Kate stood behind the counter, apron crisp, hair pulled back, watching as Joshua moved easily among the drivers, shaking hands and laughing. The change in him was obvious, and she knew it wasn't just because of her gesture that rainy night. It was because his community had closed the gap he'd been living in. Freddie sidled up to the counter, coffee in hand. "Told you help can come from places you don't expect," he said with a smirk. Kate chuckled. "Yeah, well, maybe next time I'll try to believe you sooner." As the day wound down, and the last of the trucks pulled back onto the highway, Kate stepped outside. The neon sign above the diner's door buzzed faintly, now paired with a brand new roadside sign that read, "Kate's Mile Marker Cafe, official fleet stop." The sun dipped low, turning the chrome on the parked rigs into streaks of gold. She thought back to that first night, Joshua's quiet voice, the coins on the counter, the empty thermos. She'd never imagined that a moment so small could ripple outward into all of this. Joshua came to stand beside her, both of them watching the last trucks disappear over the horizon. "Guess one cup of coffee can go a long way," he said. Kate smiled, her eyes following the fading convoy. "Sometimes it's not just the coffee. It's knowing someone cared enough to pour it." This story reminds us that the smallest acts can create the biggest ripples. What started with a simple refill of coffee became a lifeline for two people who thought they were running out of road. If you were in Kate's shoes, would you have noticed Joshua that night? Comment below. And if this touched your heart, give it a like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more stories like this. See you in the next video.